Oscar Wilde by David Goodway. 40 to 50 years ago, Oscar Wilde's reputation in Britain depended largely on his dazzling wit, dandyism, and brilliant plays. Since then, the movement for and the attainment of homosexual liberation in Western Europe and North America have led practically, given the brutality of his 2 years, particularly given the brutality of his 2 years imprisonment with hard labor, to his canonization as a gay, quote, icon. But the same period has additionally seen his acceptance as a major all-round writer. This second process began with the publication in 1962 of Rupert Hart Davis's magisterial edition of Wilde's correspondence, not only reprinting for the first time the full text of one of his masterpieces, De Profundis, but also revealing him as a superb letter writer, continued in 1969 with Richard Ellmann's selection of essays in The Artist as Critic, and concluded with Ellmann's magnificent critical biography in 1987, it being very relevant that Ellmann's two previous subjects had been W.B. Yeats and James Joyce, and that his James Joyce was recognized as one of the great achievements of contemporary literary biography. So the centenary of Wilde's death was in part marked in 2000 by the inauguration of a 9-volume Oxford English text edition of the complete works of Oscar Wilde, indicative of the full, albeit belated, acceptance of his oeuvre by the academic establishment. For some 20 years, twin industries, one gay, the other academic, and frequently both, have been generating publications on Wilde with ever more furious intensity. The lack of verbal elegance and the contorted thinking displayed by many of these are markedly at odds with Wilde's own aphoristic lucidity. In all of this, a notable absence has been informed discussion of Wilde's politics, other than sexual, given that one of his most celebrated and widely read works is his political essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. His advocacy of both socialism and individualism has tended to be viewed as a prime Wildean paradox and misconception of this basic anarchist formulation, and the anarchist position he advocated abound. The dust wrapper of the American edition of Ellmann's The Artist as Critic, for example, describes the soul of man under socialism, which the collection includes, as Wilde's argument for social reform, while in actuality he argues forcefully against social reform. Quote, "Remedies do not cure the disease, remedies merely prolong the disease. Indeed, remedies are part of the disease. The proper aim is to try and reconstruct society on such a basis that poverty will be impossible." End quote. Again, in a recent popular selection of Wilde's writings, a British academic, author of a book on Wilde, can conclude her discussion of the soul of man under socialism thus, quote, "The socialism that emerges from these pages is highly idiosyncratic, impossible to align with any kind of party politics." End quote. The state of affairs is all the more surprising in that anarchists from the outset recognized and indeed acclaimed the soul of man under socialism as an important anarchist statement, Kropotkin describing it as, quote, "the article that Oscar Wilde wrote on anarchism." End quote. The anarchist George Woodcock published an insightful book on Wilde in 1949, discussed the politics in his major history of anarchism in 1962, and concluded an extract from The Soul of Man Under Socialism, and included an extract from The Soul of Man Under Socialism in a well-known anthology of anarchist texts in 1977. Peter Marshall effectively replaced Woodcock's impressive anarchism with his massive Demanding the Impossible, in which he devotes several pages to Wilde as a, quote, "British libertarian," end quote, declaring that, quote, "his libertarian socialism is the most attractive of all the varieties of anarchism and socialism," End quote. Marshall tells me that the three things which made him personally become an anarchist were the Parisian uprising of May 1968, described by Christopher Pallas in his eyewitness account, Paris, May 1968, reading Nicholas Walter's pamphlet about anarchism, published in 1969, and reading The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Massimiliano de Amico concluded unhesitatingly in 1967. Massimiliano de Amico concluded unhesitatingly in 1967, but in an obscure English miscellany, that Wilde was, quote, an anarchist, not a socialist, end quote. While Owen Dudley Edwards, in his judicious entry for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography of 2004, describes, quote, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, end quote, as, quote, perhaps the most memorable and certainly the most aesthetic statement of anarchist theory in the English language, end quote. Recently, two outstanding Oxford doctoral theses by Sos Eltis and Paul Gibbard have identified Wilde as an anarchist and discussed his politics with considerable intelligence. It is to be hoped that Eltis's and Gibbard's work, together with the current chapter, which is able to go considerably further than they did, will eventually percolate into the general academic consciousness and beyond. Wilde is so much better known than any of the other writers examined at length in this book, and most readers will be so familiar with the principal events, sometimes notorious, of his life and the course of his career, that these will be treated less extensively than the other subjects and only discussed in detail where they are pertinent to his politics. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde was born in 1854 in Dublin to Protestant parents. As he was to stress in 1897, quote, inherited from my father and my mother a name of high distinction in literature and art, end quote. William Wilde was an ear and eye surgeon of international reputation. He was knighted in 1864, as well as a pioneer archaeologist and folklorist. Jane Wilde, like her husband, an Irish nationalist, was an even more notable personality and extravagant in dress and behavior, very much her son's mother. Using Speranza as her pseudonym, she was a poet, had also written political articles for The Nation, Young Ireland's organ, intervening in court during Charles Gavin Duffy's trial in 1848, and translated from the French and German. Both of the Wilde's sons were boarded at Portora Royal School, Enniskillen, whence they proceeded to Trinity College, Dublin. An outstanding 3 years for Oscar at Trinity were followed by a triumphant further 4 at Magdalen College, Oxford, to which he won a scholarship, again reading classics, receiving a double first, and crowning his academic career with the award of the Newdigate Poetry Prize in 1878 for Ravenna, which was to be his first independent publication. Teaching at Oxford in the 1870s were two of Wilde's major intellectual influences, both progenitors of the doctrine and movement of aestheticism, but at the same time inhabiting different moral universes. Walter Pater, a fellow at Brasenose, homosexual and aged 35 in 1874, had the previous year brought out Studies in the History of the Renaissance, whose conclusion, which Wilde supposedly knew by heart, was omitted when the book was reprinted 4 years later, since, quote, it might possibly mislead some of the young men into whose hands it might fall, end quote. For Pater, quote, not the fruit of experience, but experience itself is the end, end quote. And, quote, to burn always with this hard gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy is success in life, end quote. What he advocated was, quote, the poetic passion, the desire of beauty, the love of art for art's sake, end quote. Wilde described Pater's Renaissance as, quote, my golden book, end quote, and in prison as, quote, that book which has had such a strange influence over my life, end quote. Wilde only got to know Pater in his third year at Oxford, whereas John Ruskin and Pater never met at all. For Ruskin, the first Slade professor of fine art, and 21 years Pater's senior, much as he explicated and celebrated the work of art, ethics, and nature, both took precedence. Good art could only be produced by good men, and truth to nature was fundamental. Wilde attended Ruskin's lectures on the aesthetic and mathematics schools of Florence in his first term, eagerly accepted the call to join in building the road at Therey-Hinsky, and thereby became one of Ruskin's undergraduate friends, assuring him in 1988 that, quote, the dearest memories of my Oxford days are my walks and talks with you, end quote. Wilde's aestheticism dates then from his Oxford years, and since it was necessary for him to earn money, on Sir William's death in 1876, his inheritance was a meager £200 per annum. He proceeded to do so by moving to London and promoting himself in a very hard-headed manner as an aesthete. A long-term lecture tour of North America dressed in outrageous, quote, aesthetic, end quote, garb proved extremely lucrative in 1882. His share of the receipts amounted to a substantial $5,600, and this was followed by tours of the British and Irish provinces lasting on and off for 2 years during 1883 to 85. As such titles as The English Renaissance of Art, The House Beautiful, The Decorative Arts, Dress, and The Value of Art in Modern Life indicate Wilde was expounding in his lectures not just the ideas of Pater and aestheticism proper, but also those of Ruskin and William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. Another important influence on Wilde was indeed Morris, who met him early as 1881, reporting, quote, as the devil is painted blacker than he is, so it fares with O.W., not but what he is an ass. But he certainly is clever too, end quote. Wilde's continuing admiration for and indebtedness to Ruskin, who was delighted to hear from Lady Wilde in 1882 that, quote, Oscar was still the faithfulest of my disciples, end quote, must contribute to an explanation of the venomous animosity that developed between Wilde and Whistler. Like Wilde, a dandy and a brilliant wit, Whistler came to be affronted by the younger man, but he had been awarded derisory damages against Ruskin in libel action of 1878 that occasioned his bankruptcy, and despite his admiration for Whistler's paintings and etchings, Wilde still adhered to Ruskinian aesthetics to a significant extent. In 1885, Whistler delivered the lecture at the Queen's Hall, which became known as his 10 o'clock, in which Wilde reported for the Pall Mall Gazette. Whistler contended, quote, that nature is always right, is an assertion artistically as untrue as it is one whose truth is universally taken for granted. Nature is very rarely right, to such an extent even that it might almost be said that nature is usually wrong, that is to say, the condition of things that shall bring about the perfection of harmony worthy of a picture is rare and not common at all. This would seem to even the most intelligent a doctrine almost blasphemous. So incorporated with our education has the supposed aphorism become that its belief is held to be part of our moral being, and the words themselves have, in our ear, the ring of religion. Still, seldom does nature succeed in producing a picture. End quote. This key passage Wilde overlooked in his article the following day, referring in general to Whistler's, quote, clever satire and amusing jests, end quote. In contrast was the reaction of a great poet, Stéphane Mallarmé, who was also in the audience and according to his companion Henri de Regnier, Henri de Regnier, quote, constantly succumbed to Whistler's magic, end quote, to the extent that he translated the lecture as the influential Le Thénarclair de M. Whistler, 1888. Mallarmé was the central symbolist writer and an anarchist sympathizer. Wilde was not able to reach a position of equivalent artistic radicalism until January 1889, when, in The Decay of Lying, he too asserted the supremacy of art over nature as well as life. This essay was collected in 1891 with Pen, Pencil, and Poison and The Critic as Artist, of January 1889 and 1890 respectively, in The Brilliant Intentions. The concluding essay, The Truth of Masks, of 1885, does not belong with this volume, to the extent that Wilde appended a conclusion. Quote, not that I agree with everything that I have said in this essay. There is much with which I entirely disagree, end quote, and he instructed his French translator as early as 1891 to replace it as Je ne l'aimais plus. With The Soul of Man Under Socialism, qui contient une partie de mon esthétique, and which had appeared at the beginning of the year. The progress of Wilde's politics was initially even more timid than that of his aesthetics. In 1880, he had written his first play, Vera, or The Nihilist, which was performed in New York for a week in 1883 and never in London. This dire effort, in which the Wildean wit of the Prime Minister, Prince Paul Marilovsky, is incompatible with the primary melodrama, has attracted surprisingly generous attention from those who have been most concerned with Wilde's political ideas. Clearly inspired by the populist or Narodniks and Vera Sasulich, who launched the period of propaganda by the deed with their attempted assassination of General Trepov in 1878, the play transposes them as the Nihilists, the purely intellectual movement of the 1860s, and in the early editions specifies the action as occurring in 1800, although railways exist and the serfs are said to have been emancipated. For myself, I am unable to treat Vera as meriting serious attention of any kind. One second. The verse of the late 1870s and 1880, with political themes published in Poems in 1881, and under the collective title of Eleutheria, that is, freedom, and probably inspired by the example of his mother, has also been perceived as anticipatory of eventual anarchism. But this unremarkable poetry, while largely technically competent in a way that Vera was not, and included Quantum Mutata to Milton, Theoreticos, and Louis Napoleon, apotheosizes liberty, democracy, and republicanism at the expense of the ultra-radicalism of the masses. The sonnet, Libertatis Sacra Fames, first published in 1880, provides an allusion. Quote, albeit nurtured in democracy, and liking best that state republican, where every man is king-like and no man is crowned above his fellows, yet I see, spite of this modern fret for liberty, better the rule of one whom all obey, than to let clamorous demagogues betray our freedom with the kiss of anarchy. Wherefore I love them not whose hands profane plant the red flag upon the piled up street. For no right cause, beneath whose ignorant reign, arts, culture, reverence, honor, all things fade, save treason and the dagger of her trade, or murder with his silent bloody feet. Speranza was a typical middle-class nationalist in fearing the popular movement and its potential revolutionary excesses, and in this her son follows her. In Sonnet to Liberty concludes with an expression of their dilemma, and yet, these Christs die upon the barricades. God knows it, I am with them in some things. End quote. Vera and the early poetry, despite their strictures, do manifestly indicate an interest in revolutionary agitation and a receptivity to radical ideas, and it was from this starting point that the revival of socialism in Britain was responsible for shifting Wilde much further to the left. Although the socialist organizations, the SDF, founded in 1881 but not committed to socialism until 1883, and the Fabian Society and Socialist League, both of 1884, were minuscule, the decade saw the conversion to socialism of some of the most able intellectuals of Wilde's generation, including R.B. Cunningham Graham, Bernard Shaw, Sidney Webb, or Beatrice Webb. It was not to be until 1890, and architect W.R. Letheby, all born during the 1850s, as well as the significantly older William Morris and Edward Carpenter, and equally younger C.R. Ashby and Raymond Unwin. A surprising and little-known example of the phenomenon was Wilde's future editor, friend, and biographer, Frank Harris, who was briefly a member of the Mary Lebon branch of the Marxist SDF and a valued outdoor orator before being lost to Toryism. As early as 1883, Wilde could, when passing the Tuileries, which had been burned down by the communards, quote, whose hands profane had planted the red flag upon the piled-up street, end quote, declare, quote, there's not there one little blackened stone which is not to me a chapter in the Bible of democracy, end quote. He was recalled as attending a Socialist League lecture at Kelmscott House wearing a, quote, large crimson dahlia, end quote, as a buttonhole, quote, an incongruous figure, end quote, looking like, quote, a basket of fruit, ripe and enticing, end quote. According to Shaw, Wilde was the only literary figure in London whom he could get to sign the petition in the International Working Class Campaign of 1887 for the reprieve of the Chicago anarchists sentenced to death after a travesty of a trial. Shaw was to comment, quote, it was a completely disinterested act on his part, and it secured my distinguished consideration of him for the rest of his life, end quote. In 1889, Mae Morris invited Wilde to join a committee to promote a series of lectures by Kropotkin. And although he declined, saying he was too busy to attend its meetings, he insisted that, quote, if you think my name of any service, pray make use of it as you like, end quote. Wilde's first public declaration of socialism came in 1889 in a review of Edward Carpenter's anthology, Chants of Labor, a songbook for the people, remarking that, quote, it is for the building up of an eternal city that the socialists of our day are making music, end quote. But approving of the variousness of the poets and their contributions, he already expresses his libertarianism eloquently. Quote, this, on the whole, very promising. It shows that socialism is not going to allow herself to be trammeled by any hard and fast creed or to be stereotyped into an iron formula. She welcomes many and multiform natures. She rejects none and has room for all. She has the attraction of a wonderful personality, and touches the heart of one and the brain of another, and draws this man by his hatred of injustice, and his neighbor by his faith in the future, and a third, it may be, by his love of art, or by his wild worship of a lost and buried past. And all of this is well, for to make men socialists is nothing, but to make socialism human is a great thing." End quote. Of the major British socialists of his day, Wilde was the only one to push beyond and declare for the anarchist position. Carpenter's essential libertarianism was camouflaged, as we have seen, by his undoctrinaire outlook and his support for all trends within the labor movement, revolutionary and reformist alike. How and why was he able to do so? In 1884, Wilde had married Constance Lloyd. His first son, Cyril, was born in 1885, and second, Vivian, in 1886. He took up the editorship of The Woman's World in 1887, and he had by then deliberately abandoned the outfit of professor of aesthetics for that of the florid, out-of-date dandy. This period of change was marked by an even more notable turning point when in 1886, Wilde, aged 32, was seduced by the 17-year-old Robert Ross, who, after their affair had ended, was to be Wilde's staunchest friend and eventual literary executor. Wilde had previously been sexually ambivalent, yet this was his initiation into homosexuality, and the effect on his art and thought was startling. It is from the late 1880s and after that his finest work dates. This is the work upon which his reputation as a writer rests, and the loss of the earlier poetry, plays, and articles would be insignificant to his literary standing. In his pioneering study of 1912, Arthur Ransome, who had the full cooperation of Ross, links the transition he too perceives in the quality of the writing to first Wilde's, quote, experiments in, and then his becoming, quote, an habitual devotee, end quote, to homosexuality. Quote, "One can fancy an intense personality being created out of sin," end quote. Ransome quotes his sentence from Pen, Pencil, and Poison, which he then lists with the other two great essays of intentions, the revision of The Sphinx, some of the stories of a house of pomegranates, and Salome. Quote, "These things are among his best work. It is possible that a consciousness of separation from the common life of men is a sufficient explanation for an increased vividness in a man's life, in a man's self, a heightened ardor of production," end quote. For Richard Ellman, quote, "Homosexuality fired his mind. It was the major stage in his discovery of himself. At last he knew where he stood. His new sexual direction liberated his art. It also liberated his critical faculty," end quote. Sodomy had been a capital offense from 1533 until 1861, although death sentences had been commuted after 1835. But with the Criminal Justice Act, passed as recently as 1885, all male homosexual practices became illegal, with the creation of the new offense of indecency between males. Wilde's homosexual emancipation, therefore, brought him into potential conflict with the state. His sex life was now criminal and against the law. He would have been all too aware of the sorry story of the pre-Raphaelite artist, Simeon Salomon, some of whose work he was to own, who was prosecuted for a, quote, unnatural offense, end quote, in 1873, and had consequently been forced into destitution. In Pen, Pencil, and Poison, Wilde celebrated the romantic forger and poisoner, Thomas Griffiths Wainwright, and thereby the criminality of the artist in general. What Wilde wrote of Wainwright applies equally to Wilde himself. Quote, his crimes seem to have had an important effect upon his art. They gave a strong personality to his style, a quality that his early works certainly lacked." End quote. It is this realization of his homosexual self that provided the explanation for not only his being able to move forward to the aesthetic radicalism of intentions, but also the advocacy of anarchism in the soul of man under socialism. Wilde's opposition to government, qua government, is first expressed in 1890 when reviewing the writings of the Taoist philosopher Chuang Tzu, who was to be one of the most important influences on John Cowper Powys. Taoist thought, as has been noted in Chapter 1, particularly in the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, has been customarily regarded as having much in common with classical Western anarchism. In A Chinese Sage, Wilde paraphrases Chuang Tzu and explicates with great approbation, quote, "This curious thinker looked back with a sigh of regret to a certain golden age when there were no competitive examinations, no wearisome education systems, no missionaries, no penny dinners for the people, no established churches, no humanitarian societies, no dull lectures about one's duty to one's neighbor, and no tedious sermons about any subject at all. In those ideal days," he tells us, "people loved each other without being conscious of charity, or writing to the newspapers about it. In an evil moment, the philanthropist made his appearance, and brought with him the mischievous ideas of government." End quote. Wilde quotes Chuang Tzu as saying, quote, "There is such a thing as leaving mankind alone. There has never been such a thing as governing mankind," end quote, and comments, quote, "All modes of government are wrong. They are unscientific because they seek to alter the natural environment of man. They are immoral because, by interfering with the individual, governments produce the most aggressive forms of egotism. They are ignorant because they try to spread education. They are self-destructive because they engender anarchy," end quote. The, quote, "two pests of the age," end quote, are, quote, "governments and philanthropists," end quote. By trying, quote, "to coerce people into being good," end quote, governments, quote, "destroy the natural goodness of man," end quote. Wilde concludes that Chuang Tzu, quote, "is a very dangerous writer, and the publication of his book in English 2,000 years after his death is obviously premature, and may cause a great deal of pain to many thoroughly respectable and industrious persons," end quote, and asks, quote, "What would be the fate of governments and professional politicians if we came to the conclusion that there is no such thing as governing mankind at all," end quote. The demarcation between anarchists and other socialists comes with their attitude to government and the state. For anarchists, there can be no role for the state, even in the transition to socialism, and the only form of government that can be tolerated is self-government. That is, government from the bottom up, through voluntary association, rather than top-down. Wilde's position on these issues is unambiguously anarchist in both, quote, A Chinese Sage and The Soul of Man Under Socialism, even if sometimes confusingly expressed. Wilde emphasizes, in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, the form of government that is most suitable to the artist is no government at all. Citing Chuang Tzu, that, quote, "There is such a thing as leaving mankind alone. There is no such thing as governing mankind," end quote. He considers that, quote, the state must give up all idea of government, end quote. Quote, all modes of government are failures, end quote. And instead, quote, the state is to be a voluntary association that will organize labor and be the manufacturer and distributor of necessary commodities, end quote. The central contention is that, quote, authority and compulsion are out of the question. All association must be quite voluntary, end quote. The Critic as artist had greatly impressed Frank Harris, now editor of the Fortnightly Review, who proceeded to publish Pen, Pencil, and Poison and The Soul of Man Under Socialism. It has already been seen that Wilde believed the latter belonged with the best essays of Intentions. The Soul of Man Under Socialism, which appeared in February 1891, discusses first the problems of present capitalist society and its libertarian socialist reconstruction, while the second half is concerned with art and the position of the artist. The most striking, indeed paradoxical feature of Wilde's essay for those only accustomed to the democratic, socialist, Fabian, or Marxist forms of socialism has been his insistence on what is regarded as indispensable for those belonging to the anarchist tradition. This is the necessity for individualism being coexistent with indeed growing out of socialism. Quote, socialism, communism, or whatever one chooses to call it, by converting private property into public wealth and substituting cooperation for competition, will restore society to its proper condition of a thoroughly healthy organism and ensure the material well-being of each member of the community. It will give life its proper basis and its proper environment. But for the full development of life to its highest mode of production, something more is needed. What is needed is individualism. If the socialism is authoritarian, if there are governments armed with economic power, as they are now with political power, if, in a word, we have industrial tyrannies, then the last state of man will be worse than the first. End quote. He rightly considers that, quote, many of the socialistic views I have come across seem to be tainted with ideas of authority, if not actual compulsion, end quote, and concludes that, quote, no authoritarian socialism will do, end quote. For under such a system nobody would have any freedom at all. Quote, it is to be regretted that a portion of our community should be practically in slavery, but to propose to solve the problem by enslaving the entire community is childish, end quote. Wilde maintains typically anarchist views on a range of other matters. Disobedience, Wilde says, in terms foreshadowing Alex Comfort, is, quote, man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made, through disobedience and rebellion, end quote. This, combined with the advocacy of agitation, amounts to an espousal of direct action. He is certainly contemptuous of Parliament. Quote, agitators are a set of interfering, meddling people who come down to some perfectly contented class of the community and sow the seeds of discontent among them. That is the reason why agitators are so absolutely necessary. Without them, there would be no advance towards civilization, end quote. Authority, quote, degrades those who exercise it and degrades those over whom authority is exercised, end quote. And as for any human goodness, people should not be forced to be good. Quote, people are good when they are let alone, end quote. Quote, the Soul of Man Under Socialism is then unquestionably an anarchist text. What are much less clear are its immediate origins and its theoretical influences. We have seen that the general background in Wilde's becoming a practicing homosexual and the radicalization that this engendered, not just aesthetic but also political. There is some discussion in the essay, pertinent to his unlawful conduct, of criminals, quote, the people whom in a very arbitrary manner humanity chooses to call criminals, end quote, and their punishment, quote, as one reads history, one is absolutely sickened, not by the crimes that the wicked have committed, but by the punishments that the good have inflicted, and a community is infinitely more brutalized by the habitual employment of punishment than it is by the occasional occurrences of crime." End quote. And, quote, "with authority, punishment will pass away." End quote. There's also the impact of the anti-governmentalism and non-action of Chuang Tzu. Traditionally, there had been considerable agreement that a lecture by Bernard Shaw, quote, "probably stimulated him," end quote, as Ellman puts it, and an exposition of Shaw's Fabian socialism would have been sure to have provoked Wilde. Shaw himself recalled, quote, "a meeting somewhere in Westminster at which I delivered an address on socialism and at which Oscar turned up and spoke. Robert Ross surprised me greatly by telling me, long after Oscar's death, that it was this address of mine that moved Oscar to try his hand at a similar feat by writing The Soul of Man Under Socialism." Shaw's biographer, Michael Holroyd, asserts that Wilde, quote, "let it be known that Shaw's quintessence of Ibsenism had led him to write The Soul of Man Under Socialism," end quote. Yet, if so, this could not have been Shaw's book, which was published in 1891 after Wilde's essay had appeared in the February, but might have been Shaw's original lecture on Ibsen to the Fabian Society on the 18th of July, 1890, at the St. James Restaurant, and which was the, quote, "first form," end quote, of the quintessence of Ibsenism. Both anarchist and non-anarchist commentators have generally concurred that the principal political and economic debt in The Soul of Man Under Socialism is the great Russian anarchist communist Peter Kropotkin, resident in Britain between 1886 and 1917. The works of his available in English or French before 1891 included an appeal to the young, Parole d'une Revolte, Law and Authority, the Place of Anarchism in Human Evolution, and Anarchist Morality. Wilde was to pay a memorable tribute to De Profundis, quote, "two of the most perfect lives I have come across in my own experience are the lives of Verlaine and of Prince Kropotkin, both of them men who passed years in prison. The first, the one Christian poet since Dante, the other a man with the soul of that beautiful white Christ that seems coming out of Russia," end quote. George Woodcock, however, regards William Godwin rather than Kropotkin as the dominant influence, while Peter Marshall agrees that the soul is pure Godwin. He concedes that, quote, "there is no clear evidence of indebtedness," end quote. And Marcelino de Amico contends convincingly.
You know when you're going to be leaving?
I don't know, probably like 2 or something.
I'm gonna close up the living room.
Oh, that's fine.
Alright, so all you gotta worry about is like the bathroom and the kitchen.
Okay, cool.
You really don't have to do anything in the kitchen except close that little window over the sink.
Sounds good.
Make sure the fans are all turned off.
Alrighty. Where was I? George Woodcock, however, regards William Godwin rather than Kropotkin as the dominant influence, while Peter Marshall agrees that the soul is pure Godwin. He concedes that, quote, "there is no clear evidence of indebtedness," end quote, and Marcelino de Amico contends convincingly that it is improbable that Wilde had direct acquaintance with political justice, though fully familiar with the poetry of Shelley, whom he certainly admired. In addition, there is the undeniable presence of Morris and News from Nowhere, serialized in Commonweal, January to October 1890, and published as a book in Boston, Massachusetts, without permission before the end of the year, and in London the following March. As has been seen, Wilde admired and knew Morris and attended Socialist League meetings at Kelmscott House. Only one letter between the two men survives, with Wilde writing effusively, in probably March or April 1891, to thank Morris for a presentation volume, once believed to be possibly News from Nowhere, but now considered to be The Roots of the Mountain. Intellectual sources for the decisive emphasis on individualism are even harder to pinpoint. Isabel Murray has demonstrated that to the traditional list of modern authors most important to Wilde, Ruskin, Pater, and Matthew Arnold, must be added Ralph Waldo Emerson, and argued that in particular his essay Self-Reliance and Considerations by the Way, provide the basis for much of Wilde's approach to the, quote, soul. The essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Emerson's own proximity to anarchism has long been appreciated, Kropotkin naming him in his Encyclopedia Britannica entry on anarchism, and Marshall including in his History of Anarchism a brief treatment of Emerson as a, quote, American libertarian, end quote. Then there is Emerson's protege, Thoreau, who in On the Duty of Civil Disobedience maintained that, quote, that government is best which governs not at all, end quote, which is more than echoed in Wilde's, quote, the form of government that is most suitable to the artist is no government at all, end quote. The expansive individualism of Walt Whitman, whom Wilde had twice visited and definitely admired, should also be mentioned. Josephine M. Guy and Ian Small usefully bring in the unfamiliar name of Grant Allen, described by Morris as a, quote, Herbert Spencerite, end quote, but who was sympathetic to socialism and whose article, Individualism and Socialism, Morris lectured on, together with Edward Bellamy's State Socialist Looking Backward, in 1889 to the Socialist League. Allen was to congratulate Wilde on the soul, which he described as, quote, noble and beautiful, end quote, adding, quote, I would have written every line of it myself, if I had known how, end quote. What remains entirely unknown, though, is Wilde's degree of acquaintance with the powerful strain of non-socialist individualist anarchism, whose major theorists were Stirner and Tucker. While Stirner's great Der Einzige und sein Eigentum remained untranslated into English or French until 1900 and 1907 respectively, Wilde could read German, but it is far from irrelevant that the political writer whom James Joyce most respected was Tucker. The Soul of Man Under Socialism is a surprisingly disjointed, fragmentary essay lurching from consideration of the socialist emancipation of the masses to its preoccupation with the condition of the artist. Arthur Ransome complains, with considerable justice, that it is, quote, like notes from half a dozen charming and at the same time daring talks, thrown together and loosely brought into some sort of unity by a frail connecting thread, end quote. Yet it is redeemed by the generosity of its vision, by the quality of mind and of spirit displayed, and by its glittering prose and epigrammatic delights. Ransome was puzzled by the, quote, extraordinary position, end quote, which he understood it to have, and taken in, quote, the literature of revolution, end quote. For while not regarded as important in Britain, with no significant anarchist movement, the essay was translated into many languages, and, as a pamphlet in many editions, proving especially popular within the radical movements of Central and Eastern Europe, and the USA, with Jews being, according to Sherard, among its most enthusiastic readers. The German translators were none other than Gustav Landauer and his wife, Hedwig Lachmann. Not unnaturally, the soul of man was also esteemed by writers and other artists. For while Wilde reviewed them in the present society as the only, quote, real men, the men who have realized themselves, and in whom humanity gains a partial realization, end quote, Wilde was going far beyond this by affording them the hope of total economic, intellectual, and artistic freedom. The essay so corresponded with his own political position and artistic beliefs that Joyce was granted permission in 1909 to translate it into Italian, although failed to do so. John Cowper Powys, who in 1916 proposed that it was, quote, perhaps the wisest and most eloquent revolutionary tract ever written, end quote, proceeded 7 years later to write an introduction to an American edition. Quote, what the book really represents is a psychological phenomenon of the gravest importance in the history of humanity, nothing less than the going over to the camp of the disinherited, of the children of the richest inheritance, end quote. And George Orwell, who told George Woodcock that he had, quote, always been very pro-Wilde, end quote, in 1948 considered the soul of man to have worn, quote, remarkably well, end quote, serving to, quote, remind the socialist movement of its original, half-forgotten objective of human brotherhood, end quote, and describing it as, quote, utopian and anarchistic, end quote. While Sherard has Wilde referring approvingly to the, quote, instinctive anarchy which lies at the bottom of the hearts of most men, end quote, and Stuart Morrill remarked that, quote, I even believe that between 2 glasses of champagne, end quote, at the height of his fame, he would, quote, willingly profess himself an anarchist, end quote. There are only 2 known occasions when he explicitly referred to himself as an anarchist. He told an interviewer in 1894, we are all of us more or less socialists nowadays. I think I am rather more than a socialist. I am something of an anarchist, I believe, but of course the dynamite policy is very absurd indeed, end quote. The previous year he had stated less hesitantly, autrefois j'étais poète et tyran. Fuck this, I'm not reading that. In the past I was, it says in the why am I trying to read that? In the past I was a poet and a tyrant. Now I am an artist and an anarchist. This was his answer to a referendum artistique et social conducted by the Parisian literary journal Le Hermitage, and inquiring, quote, which is the better condition of social good, a spontaneous and free organization or an organization that is disciplined and methodic? Which of these conceptions should be the preference of the artist, end quote. Of the 99 artists who responded to these questions, very much weighted towards anarchism in their wording, 52 opted for, quote, free and spontaneous organization, end quote, while 11 grouped themselves as, quote, partisans of absolute liberty, of anarchy, end quote. An essential dimension to understanding Wilde is to situate him in the context of France. In England, he always appeared an outlandish figure. In his appearance, his behavior, his writings, his politics. The French were accustomed to such flamboyant, larger-than-life personalities, and he blended into the overall literary and artistic scene, although that is not to say that they were not strongly appreciative of his genius. In France, his sexuality was not against the law. In France, his literary output fitted naturally into symbolism, modulating into decadence, and Paul Gibbard very properly considers him a symbolist writer, whereas across the Channel, the only comparable major artist, Aubrey Beardsley, was an equally exotic and alien flowering. In France, too, the symbolist writers of the late 1880s and 1890s and the concurrent neo-impressionist painters were strongly committed to anarchism, not just in sentiment, but often practically as well, and it was the French symbolists who drew attention to Wilde's anarchist position. Wilde, whose French was fluent, had already visited Paris several times before. Enabled by his earnings from his American lectures, he spent almost 4 months there in 1883, meeting, among others, Edmond de Goncourt, Edgar Degas, Camille and Lucien Pissarro, Paul Verlaine, and the following year he honeymooned in Paris, avidly reading Joris Karl Huysmans' newly published A Rebours. The really significant stays were to come in 1891, when in February he gained the respect of Mayarme, who was to be impressed by the picture of Dorian Gray, described by Ellman as, quote, a central document in symbolism, end quote, and then in November and December writing Salome, and being hailed as, quote, le great event des salons littéraires parisiens of the season. By this last visit, it is known that he had become friendly with such prominent symbolists as Jean Montréal, Henri de Regnier, Pierre Louis, Rémy de Gourmont, Adolphe Lettet, Marcel Schwab, and the Americans Stuart Merrill and Francis Vierle Griffin, as well as Marcel Proust and André Gide. Merrill, Rete, and Louis were to revise the French of Salome, while Schwab, to whom the Sphinx was dedicated, corrected the proofs. Of these writers, Regnier, de Gourmont, Rete, Merrill, Vierle Griffin were all actively anarchist at that time, while Mayarme subscribed to Jean Graves' anarchist communist La Révolte, as did Huysmans' Anatole France, and the elderly Parnassian Le Comte de Lille. As Jean Mitron, the outstanding historian of French anarchism, comments, quote, I don't know how to read. I hate that so much in books where they fucking just quote in a different language and they don't fucking translate it. It's like, dude, help me out. Even more staunchly anarchists were the neo-impressionist painters, the Pissarros, Paul Signac, Maximilien Luce, Albert Dubois Pillet, Charles Anglin, and Henri Edmond Cross, championed by the symbolist critic Félix Fénéon, who was put on trial in 1894 for his anarchism, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who, although not known to have expressed political opinions, is convincingly nominated by Richard D. Sohn as the representative anarchist artist, painted a panel of 1895 for the booth of the dancer La Goule, in which he brings together the highly distinctive figures of Fénéon and Wilde as spectators, quote, elbow to elbow, end quote, as Fénéon was to put it, yet in spirit of Wilde, listing Lautrec Among those to receive copies of the first edition of An Ideal Husband in 1899, suggestive of an encounter with Le Havre during June, there is no documentary evidence of the two men ever having met. From the viewpoint of Anglo-Saxony, Wilde's adherence to anarchism no doubt seems yet another bizarre characteristic of an extravagant career, but as a natural member of this French cultural milieu, it would have been astonishing if he had not done so. 5 months after the appearance of The Soul of Man Under Socialism in the Fortnightly Review, an abridged French translation entitled Individualism was published in La Revolte, Grave, the follower of Kropotkin, agreeing that, quote, art is the supreme manifestation of individualism, end quote. French anarchism in the early 1890s was not only characterized by its appeal to the literary and artistic avant-gardes. Between March 1892 and June 1894, 9 people died in 11 dynamite explosions in Paris. This terrorist phase was initiated by Francois Claudius Vavachol, detonating 2 bombs at blocks of flats where judges lived. Auguste Vaillant's bomb was flung from the gallery into the Chamber of Deputies. In contrast, Émile Henry was responsible for the 20 casualties, one of them fatal, in a station cafe crowded with lower middle class and even working class customers. The period of propaganda by the deed terminated with the assassination of President Sadi Carnot in Lyon by an Italian, Santo Cassiero. All 4 dynamitards were executed, but whereas most anarchists and working people in general admired Ravachol, Vaillant, and Cassiero, they had serious reservations about Henry's last act of February 1894. Britain was scarcely affected by the anarchist violence of continental Europe, although there were several minor incidents. In early 1892, in the case of the Walsall anarchists, 4 men, including a Frenchman and an Italian, received lengthy prison sentences for conspiring to manufacture a bomb 4 days after Henry's attentat in Paris. A young French anarchist, Martial Bourdin, was carrying a bomb in Greenwich Park, was killed by it, an affair in which Conrad drew in The Secret Agent. Wilde's comment that the, quote, dynamite policy is very absurd indeed, end quote, came a month later. Also, on the 31st of December, a young poet had discharged 5 rounds from a revolver at the wall of the House of Commons near the Speaker's residence. He proceeded to hand the weapon to a police constable, saying, quote, I am an anarchist, and I intended shooting you. But then I thought it a pity to shoot an honest man. What I have done is to show my contempt for the House of Commons, end quote. John Evelyn Barlaw, who used the nom de plume of Evelyn Douglas, was remanded in custody, and next appeared in court on the 7th of January, supported by Wilde, John Gray, and John Davidson. 9 days later, he was bound over to be of good behavior, and kept the peace for 2 months for a surety of £200, £100 on Wilde's reconnaissance, and the other half being guaranteed by the prominent socialist H. Champion. It was Champion, once secretary of the SDF, who previously unknown to Wilde had called at Tite Street to get him to go to Westminster Police Court, thereby making him late for the reading of Lady Windermere's Fan to the actor-manager George Alexander. There is no evidence that Wilde was influenced politically by Barlaw. But previous writers on his anarchism have stressed the significance of their friendship while not knowing a great deal about it. Although born in Rangoon in 1860, the son of a merchant, Barlaw was Scottish. He was a descendant of Kate Douglas, a 15th century heroine, and educated at Merchant Taylor's School and New College, Oxford. If he's Scottish, then I might be pronouncing it wrong. I thought it was French, so I don't think it's Barlaw. I think it might be Barlas. It was at Oxford that Barlas had met Wilde, but he knew also Robert Sherrar, who, before being sent down for non-payment of debts, was an undergraduate at New College for a year, and Wilde and Sherrar, who was to write 4 books about Wilde, were to become firm friends in Paris in 1883. After Oxford, Barlaw entered the Middle Temple before turning to teaching, first for a couple years at a Jesuit college in Ireland, next in Chelmsford, where he taught at the grammar school, formed a socialist society, and left in December 1886, moving on to Egham and coaching entrance for the army. In London, he lived in poverty in Lambeth and elsewhere in the late 1880s and early 1890s when he became a member of the Rhymers Club. Between 1884 and 1893, he published 8 volumes of poetry, all now exceedingly rare, usually under the name of Evelyn Douglas, save for the anonymous Holy of Holies, Confessions of an Anarchist. Although his oeuvre is overwhelmingly love poetry and notable for its lack of socio-political content, it displays more talent and reads better than Wilde's early verse. The romantic explanation for his later mental instability attributes it to a blow received on Bloody Sunday, November 1887, when batoned by the police in Trafalgar Square. He fell, the story runs, at the feet of Eleanor Marx, but it seems more probable that it was caused by syphilis. He was an active propagandist, initially as a lecturer and organizer of the Marxist SDF, but in 1888-9, he followed Chameleon in quitting it and joining the Labor Electoral Association. He could write to Bruce Glazier in 1889 that he was, quote, neither exclusively collectivist nor anarchist, end quote, and then gravitated towards the Anarchist Socialist League, for which he was working from at least May 1891. The veteran anarchist and fellow Scot, Tom Bell, of whom more later, but he is not to be confused with the Glaswegian ironmoulder, SLP militant and future communist stalwart of the same name, had no hesitation in calling Barras an anarchist, having met him as, quote, an extraordinarily able young man who had lately come into the movement, end quote, at, quote, the first conference of anarchists in Scotland, end quote. Wilde responded to Barlas's gratitude in January 1892 by writing, quote, whatever I did was merely what you would have done for me or for any friend of yours whom you admired and appreciated. We poets and dreamers are all brothers, end quote. End quote. I must come and see you soon, end quote. Signing himself, quote, your affectionate friend, Oscar. The following month, he provided a reference for Barlas to be admitted to the reading room of the British Museum, instructing him to, quote, send me a line, poet and scholar, and know me forever your friend, end quote. Barlas's violent behavior continued, and not long afterwards he collapsed into mental illness. He was arrested once more, this time for unprovoked assault in Crieff, Perthshire, and was confined first at an asylum in Perth, and later for many years in Gart Naval Asylum, Glasgow, where he died in 1914. Barlas had published an article in April 1892 in praise of Wilde with a splendid conclusion. Quote, A man who is all this, and whose fate has cast him upon these latter days, cannot fail to be a revolutionist, and this voluptuous artist is a very Michael, or rather a Raphael, for he does not use physical means but spiritual, nor are his spiritual weapons of the coarser kind, noisy and explosive. He does not use dynamite but the dagger, a dagger whose hilt is crusted and with flaming jewels, and whose point drips with the poison of the Borgias. That dagger is the paradox. No weapon could be more terrible. He has stabbed all our proverbs, and our proverbs rule us more than our kings. Perhaps it is better to say he uses sheet lightning. With a sudden flash of wit he exposes to our settled eyes the sheer cliff-like walls of the rift, which has opened out, as if by a silent earthquake, between our moral belief and the belief of our fathers. That fissure is the intellectual revolution." End quote. In a period of lucidity in 1905, Barlas wrote to his son, equally well, albeit less showily, that Wilde, quote, "was and remains my ideal of a man of genius in this generation, his words and writing half concealing under an appearance of sportive levity unheard of profundity of perception and thought." End quote. Similarly, Richard Le Gallienne argued from the vantage point of the 1920s that Wilde was the, quote, "symbolic figure," end quote, of the late Victorian revolt of the 1880s and 1890s, and Wilde was, quote, "the incarnation of the spirit of the 90s," end quote. The significance of the 90s is that they began to apply all the new ideas that had become for some time accumulated. Quote, "The significance of the 90s is that they began to apply all the new ideas that had been for some time accumulating from the disintegrating action of scientific and philosophic thought on every kind of spiritual, moral, social, and artistic convention, and all forms of authority demanding obedience merely as authority. Hence came the widespread assertion and demonstration of individualism that is still progressing. Wilde was the synthesis of all these phenomena of change. Wilde may be said to have included T.H. Huxley and Pater and Morris and Whistler and Mr. Bernard Shaw and Mr. Max Beerbohm in the amazing eclecticism of his extravagant personality that seems to have borrowed everything and made everything his own." End quote. The 4 years after the appearance of The Soul of Man Under Socialism saw Wilde's spectacular success on the London stage with his great series of plays, Lady Windermere's Fan, which opened in 1892, A Woman of No Importance, 1893, An Ideal Husband, 1895, The Importance of Being Earnest, 1895. At first sight, comedies set in aristocratic circles seemed improbable products of a committed anarchist mind. There is just one expression of a mainline anarchist belief, when Lord Illingworth remarks, quote, "You can't make people good by act of parliament," end quote. Although he also says, as in The Soul, quote, "Discontent is the first step in the progress of a man or a nation," end quote. When Algie Minecreef explains in The Importance of Being Earnest that the imaginary Bunbury had, quote, "quite exploded," end quote, that afternoon, and Lady Bracknell inquires, quote, "Was he the victim of a revolutionary outrage?" end quote. It is a solitary reference to the world of contemporary anarchist struggle. All the same, Barlas was perfectly correct when he said that Wilde, quote, "half concealed under an appearance of sportive levity unheard of profundity of perception and thought," end quote. And equally that he exposed, quote, "with a sudden flash of wit," end quote, quote, "the rift which has opened out between our moral belief and the belief of our fathers," end quote. In the first 3 of the society comedies, Wilde subverts established morality, arguing for a more flexible and fully human, one could say libertarian code of conduct in place of the rigid rules and ungenerous spirit of Victorianism. In Lady Windermere's Fan, Miss Erlin, the previously demonized, quote, woman with a past, end quote, is finally recognized by Lady Windermere to be, quote, a very good woman, end quote. There is a similar progression in An Ideal Husband, where Sir Robert Chiltern, conventionally considered to be, quote, an ideal husband, end quote, but exposed as having once committed a politically corrupt act, laments, quote, why can't you women love us, faults and all? Why do you place us on monstrous pedestals? We have all feet of clay, women as well as men. It is not the perfect, but the imperfect who have need of love, end quote. While his wife can state, quote, life has taught me that a person who has once been guilty of a dishonest and dishonorable action may be guilty of it a second time and should be shunned, end quote, believing that the rule should be applied to, quote, everyone without exception, end quote. At the end of the play, though, Sir Robert can be loved by his wife for what he is, quote, faults and all, end quote. His sister having commented, quote, an ideal husband. Oh, I don't think I should like that. It sounds like something in the next world, end quote. Lady Windermere had believed that the same as Lady Windermere had believed the same as Lady Chiltern in an irrefragable moral code. This is like a lines from a play. Lord Darlington, I think life too complex a thing to be settled by these hard and fast rules. Lady Windermere, if we had, quote, these hard and fast rules, end quote, we should find life much more simple. Lord Darlington, you allow of no exceptions? Lady Windermere, none. It can be seen that, as Lord Windermere expostulates, quote, how hard good women are, end quote. Chiltern says of his wife, quote, she stands apart as good women do, pitiless in her perfection, cold and stern and without mercy, end quote. And that, quote, good people do a great deal of harm in this world, end quote, as Lord Darlington believes. Yet Lady Windermere comes to recant, quote, I don't think now that people can be divided into the good and bad as though they were two separate races or creations, end quote. A woman of no importance is much less interesting ethically than either Lady Windermere's Fan or An Ideal Husband, but it is here that Wilde has one of his mouthpieces summarize what he himself presumably believed. Quote, intellectual generalities are always interesting, but generalities in morals mean absolutely nothing, end quote. Similarly, the comment of the blackmailing Miss Cheveley in An Ideal Husband, that, quote, morality is simply the attitude we adopt towards people whom we personally dislike, end quote, sounds like Wilde's own position. His position is antipodian to the bourgeois morality of his own day or of our own, and with the latter we need to include the equally Procrustean prejudices of political correctness. When Wilde was arrested on the 5th of April, 1895, both An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest had only recently opened in London, but although they had been playing to full houses, they were soon taken off and were not to be revived until after his death. In contrast, France in general was bemused by his sentence to 2 years' hard labor, and symbolist and anarchist Paris was outraged. The novelists Paul Adam and Octave Mirbeau defended him in print as early as May and June, respectively, Adam's article being illustrated with a sketch of Wilde by Toulouse-Lautrec in La Revue Blanche, whose editor, Fénéon, also supported him. Stuart Morrill attempted to gather signatures to a petition for clemency, and the first public performance of Salome took place in February 1896, with Toulouse-Lautrec designing the program at Lulin Poe's Théâtre Les Ouvriers, of which Morrill was the manager. Imprisonment was to bring Wilde's career as a writer to an end, but not before it had enabled him to produce two of his finest works. The long letter to Lord Alfred Douglas, published posthumously by Robert Ross in heavily abridged form as De Profundis, and his one great poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, or Gaul. I forget how it's pronounced. His terrible experience, brutal and degrading, served only to confirm and deepen his libertarian social, political, and ethical views, expressed in both of these as well as in other correspondence of his final years. In the resplendent prose and lucid thinking of De Profundis, Wilde rejects, quote, morality, end quote. Quote, I am a born antinomian. I am one of those who are made for exceptions, not for laws, end quote. He remembers telling Guide, quote, as we sat together in some Paris cafe, that metaphysics had little but real interest for me, and morality absolutely none, end quote. And so, quote, I need not tell you that to me reformations in morals are as meaningless and vulgar as reformations in theology, end quote. He has a good deal to say about his individualism, asserting, quote, I am far more of an individualist than I ever was, end quote. In a central passage, the meaning becomes clearer if, quote, anarchist is substituted for, quote, individualist, and, quote, the state for, quote, society. Quote, people used to say to me that I was too individualistic. I must be far more of an individualist than I ever was. I must get far more out of myself than I ever got and ask far less of the world than I have ever asked. Indeed, my ruin came not from too great individualism of life, but from too little. The one disgraceful, unpardonable, and to all time contemptible action of my life was allowing myself to be forced into appealing to society for help and protection against your father. To have made such an appeal against anyone would have been, from the individualist point of view, bad enough. Once I had put into motion the forces of society, society turned on me and said, quote, you have been living all this time in defiance of my laws, and do you now appeal to those laws for protection? You shall have those laws exercised to the full. You shall abide by what you have appealed to, end quote. The result is I am in Gaul, or Gaul, whatever you call prison. It is this society that, quote, takes upon itself the right to inflict appalling punishments on the individual, end quote, while, quote, there is no prison in any world into which love cannot force an entrance, end quote. Wilde's conclusion is the anarchist one that, quote, the prison system is absolutely and entirely wrong, end quote. In the first of two prosaic yet magnificent letters to the Daily Chronicle, Wilde itemized the, quote, prison system, end quote, as, quote, the governor, the chaplain, the warders, the lonely cell, the isolation, the revolting food, the rules of the prison commissioners, the mode of discipline, as it is termed, the life, end quote. He also repeats there what he contended in The Soul of Man as to the degrading essence of authority. Quote, authority is as destructive to those who exercise authority as it is to those on whom authority is exercised, end quote. In the Ballad of Reading Gaul, similarly, it is not simply capital punishment which is rejected, but prison in general. Quote, every prison that men build is built with bricks of shame, and bound with bars lest Christ should see how men their brothers maim. With bars they blur the gracious moon, and blind the goodly sun, and they do well to blind their hell, for in it things are done that Son of God nor Son of Man ever should look upon. The vilest deeds, like prison weeds, bloom well in prison air. It is only what is good in man that wastes and withers there. End quote. As for law, while there is initially feigned hesitance, quote, I know not whether laws be right or whether laws be wrong, end quote. There is regardless no doubting, quote, but this I know, that every law that man had made for man, since first man took his brother's life, and the sad world began, but straws the wheat and shaves the chaff with a most evil fan, end quote. Alexander Berkman used this stanza as the epigraph to his prison memoirs of an anarchist, which with the preceding verse and the following verse similarly served Carpenter for prisons, police, and punishment. In 1891, in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, Wilde could maintain the typically anarchist yet optimistic opinion that, quote, even in prison a man can be quite free. His soul can be free. His personality can be untroubled. He can be at peace, end quote. By 1898, writing to Cunningham Graham after Bloody Week, had 6 weeks' experience of Pentonville, his outlook was equally anarchist, but now lugubrious. Quote, I wish we could meet to talk over the many prisons of life, prisons of stone, prisons of passion, prisons of intellect, prisons of morality, and the rest. All limitations, external or internal, are prison walls, and life is a limitation. Finally, end quote. Finally, from the last year of Wilde's life come confirmation, discussion, and details of his anarchism that remarkably never seem to have been drawn upon by any previous commentator on Wilde. They appear at length in a 477-page typescript, quote, called Oscar Wilde Without Whitewash, begun after a related title of 1930, Oscar Wilde's Unwritten Play, was sent for publication, and before Frank Harris's death in 1931, and completed by 1935, but with some additions of 1938, and owned by the outstanding research collection of Wilde materials, the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library at the University of California, Los Angeles. The testimony is that of Thomas H. Tom Bell, who, far from being an eccentric or peripheral observer, was close to the heart of the international anarchist movement. Between 1890 and 1940, the friend of Emma Goldman and Rudolph Rocker, and brother-in-law of John Turner, the first person to be deported from the USA under anarchist exclusion following McKinley's assassination, and future General Secretary of the Shop Assistants Union. Bell was born in Edinburgh in 1867, had been a member of the Scottish Land and Labour League and the SDF. claiming indeed to have converted James Connolly to socialism before becoming an anarchist. As a ship's engineer, he traveled widely, becoming an accomplished linguist and able to work as an interpreter and stenographer. Tom Bell emigrated to the USA in 1904 and farmed in Arizona for 10 years before moving to Los Angeles, where he was active in the Libertarian group, which published his fine pamphlet and only freestanding work in English, Edward Carpenter, the English Tolstoy, in 1932. John Cowper Powys was interested by Goldman in quote, Oscar Wilde Without Whitewash, end quote, and promised to write a preface for it, even though he reported that his agent, Lawrence Pollinger, was, quote, very scared of it for fear of libel action, end quote, by Lord Alfred Douglas, and that it could never be published in Britain while Douglas was still alive. Powys considered, quote, it's a good book on Wilde, it's as good a book on Wilde as I ever seen, end quote, reporting to Lewis Wilkinson, who had befriended Wilde as a correspondent in 1898 while still a schoolboy, that it was, quote, most lively and vivid reading. I can see very vivid possibilities for this great, long, rambling book, end quote, though very rightly commenting that, quote, what it wants is editing and revising, end quote. Bell was, however, to be disappointed. He died in 1942, and his book has only ever appeared in Argentina, shortened and in Spanish translation. From 1898, Bell worked for 6 years as secretary to Frank Harris, who was much impressed by his command of languages. Oscar Wilde Without Whitewash was first called Oscar Wilde, Frank Harris, Alfred Douglas, and myself. Bell had met both Douglas and his father, the Marquis of Queensberry, and most unusually liked them both. And the original title was considerably more appropriate since the typescript contains as much, if not more, about Harris as it does about Wilde. In 1900, Wilde and Harris agreed to write a play together, with Wilde supplying the plot, and Bell describes himself as the, quote, intermediary, end quote, or, quote, go-between, selected by Wilde himself for the collaboration. For even when Harris was back in London, for when Harris was back in London. Since, quote, Wilde wrote nothing at all, not even the first act, not one word, end quote. Bell's role in the process failed to materialize, and Harris had to write this play single-handedly. Mr. and Mrs. Daventry, opening in London a month before Wilde's death in Paris on the 30th of November. Bell had first met Wilde with Harris and an unnamed French writer, quote, sometime in the summer of 1900, end quote, when there was, quote, an hour or so of conversation, end quote, in Harris's rooms at the Elysee Palace Hotel. 2 or 3 days later, there was a second meeting there, but now between Wilde and Bell alone. Bell was not to see Wilde alive again because of the non-operation of the collaboration, but late in November, quote, my friend Bell, end quote, as Harris calls him, was dispatched with money for the importunate Wilde. He arrived at the Hotel d'Alsace 2 or 3 hours too late to find a nun sitting at the side of Wilde's corpse. The crucial encounter, then in summer of 1900, when Wilde and Bell met alone, and Bell got him talking about politics in what he described as a, quote, real long talk, end quote. Bell regarded the soul of man under socialism as, quote, in its day bold and original, end quote, despite the fact that, quote, Wilde was too much concerned with aesthetics to concern himself with economics, too full of wit to deal seriously at any length with any social question, end quote. Quote, Harris told Wilde that I had been accepted as a friend by William Morris, by Peter Kropotkin and Edward Carpenter. Wilde spoke of them to me, particularly about Morris, laughing with me, with tender memory, at Morris's blunt ways, and the terribly rough language, the quite incredibly, quite impossibly rough language he could use on appropriate occasion, end quote. Bell considered that, quote, in his politics and social views, end quote, Wilde, quote, had just the same outlook as Kropotkin, and though naturally he deals more with art than with economics, his teaching is on just the same line, and is just as clear and strong and plain spoken, end quote. He, quote, had evidently read Love's Coming of Age and spoke warmly of Carpenter, end quote. Indeed, Wilde was to write in September 1900, quote, what a charming book Edward Carpenter's Civilization, Cause and Cure is. It is most suggestive. I constantly read it, end quote. And he is known to have annotated his copy. Bell, quote, mentioned also a mutual friend, John Barlas, of whom Wilde spoke with warm affection, end quote. While Bell had no doubt that the primary anarchist influence on Wilde came from Kropotkin, he also brings in a fairly new name, that of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Quote, I told him in our talk that I was not a Kropotkinian, but had arrived where I was through Proudhon. He evidently understood quite well the difference between the two, and there was some little talk about them. The influence of Proudhon on him is plain. Wilde probably did not get much of a grasp of Proudhon's economic theory. He is neither an economist nor a businessman to be interested in the details of mutual banking. But in the soul of man, the Proudhon influence in political theory and in style is very evident. It is true that Wilde might have got the political theory indirectly. His bosom friend Barlas was well read in Proudhon, and he must have met other libertarians who could explain this. But he had himself read at least some of Proudhon's works, including certainly the famous I think it's What is Property in French, but so here it goes. Qu'est-ce que la propriété, which had to be read by every well-educated radical at the time. Scherrer has him quoting Proudhon. According to von Liebig, he had read quite a good deal of Proudhon and spoke about him often. A short examination of Proudhon will show that Wilde's criticism of democratic government in the soul of man is that made by Proudhon long years before, and insofar as the style in it had any origin other than his own genius, it is surely that of the great French master of the epigram and the paradox, end quote. It comes as no surprise when Bell remarks that he, quote, never heard that Wilde understood the importance, end quote, of the British retail or consumers' cooperative movement. But he goes on to report his interest in, quote, the ideas of the self-governing cooperative workshop, end quote, or producers' co-ops. Bell says that Wilde called his attention to the account in Chernyshevsky's novel What is to be Done of the description of the dressmakers' cooperative workshop, which the middle-class heroine Vera Pavlovna sets up for needlewomen. What is to be done had been translated into English from the French edition by none other than Benjamin Tucker, serialized in his Liberty, and published in book form in 1886. Wilde also spoke of another novel, Sir Walter Besant's All Sorts and Conditions of Men, published in 1882, in which Angela Messenger, quote, the richest heiress in England, end quote, establishes the Stepney Dressmakers Association, another cooperative workshop which was, quote, to be self-governed and to share the proceeds among them with regard to skill and industry, end quote, and the idea of which Wilde said had been taken from What is to be Done, but which in Besant's version is equipped with a tennis court and gymnasium. Bell quotes several passages from All Sorts and Conditions of Men, suggesting that Wilde was influenced by these and Besant's wit when he wrote The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Quote, ask her if she wants to do the grandest thing ever done for men. Ask her if she will as a new and startling point of departure. Remember that men want joy. If she will ask, I will deliver a lecture on the necessity of pleasure, the desirableness of pleasure, the beauty of pleasure, end quote. Quote, you think that governments can do everything for you. You fools. Has any government ever done anything for you? Can it give you what you'd want? No, end quote. Quote, we could make them discontented at least, said Angela. Discontent must come before reform. End quote. Quote, we should leave them to reform themselves, end quote, said Harry. Quote, the mistake of philanthropists is to think that they can do for people what can only be done by the people, end quote. And Angela, the philanthropist, writes, quote, without discontent nothing can be done, end quote. Undoubtedly there is a relationship between the two texts. Proudhon has been scarcely mentioned, and producers' cooperation, Chernyshevsky and Besant, are all quite new in discussions of Wilde's anarchism, but none of this is implausible, and it significantly extends our knowledge of his political ideas and interests. It must be mentioned, however, that on one matter Bell strains confidence in his reliability by entirely going over the top. He writes of Frank Harris's misjudgment in publishing in the Fortnightly Review an article by French anarchist Charles Mulatto, rhapsodizing Ravachol and Henry, and contributing in 1894 to Harris's dismissal as editor. He later added as an afterthought a handwritten footnote that, quote, Ravachol was the man in whom Wilde was so much interested, whose body he went to see after the execution, end quote. Ravachol was guillotined far away from Paris in the small town of Montbrison, Loire, on 11th of July, 1892. The execution was public. Wilde was that month taking a cure at Bad Homburg, near Frankfurt am Main, with Alfred Douglas. He was 18 months later to pronounce that, quote, the dynamite policy is very absurd indeed, end quote. Although in 1898 he was to meet a young poet who was, quote, the intimate friend of Emile Henry, and has told me wonderful things about him and his life, end quote. Bell also says that his friend Rudolf von Liebig, quote, taught music to Wilde's children and French to his wife, end quote. Yet this seems most unlikely, since it is unmentioned in Liebig's brief memoir of Wilde. As with Carpenter, Wilde can also be regarded as anarchist in his, quote, sexual philosophy, end quote. And while Bell did not talk to him about this, he did with, quote, 2 or 3 of his friends, among them Harris, end quote. Bell reports that they agreed that, quote, Wilde went further than Carpenter. Carpenter merely defended the person who chose homosexuality instead of heterosexuality. Wilde, I was told, declared in theory for both, end quote. That is, Wilde was an advocate of bisexuality. Quote, he was quoted to me as saying, he was quoted to me as speaking of, quote, the enjoyment in music of the tenor as well as the soprano, end quote, as being for, quote, the possibility of passionate friendship between any two human beings, end quote. I was told that when it was objected to him that he was merely, quote, proposing to use the left hand instead of the right, end quote, he had declared himself, quote, for the seizure of enjoyment boldly with both hands, end quote. Most anarchist of all, and anticipatory of Aldous Huxley, Christopher Pallas, and particularly Alex Comfort, quote, he had explained that he was for the, quote, liberation of sexual emotions over the greatest possible area, end quote, for the, quote, opening up of a new region of voluptuous and aesthetic sensation, end quote, end quote. The heterosexual Bell explains that when he spoke to Wilde alone, he was, quote, on a footing quite different to that of our first meeting, end quote. Quote, it was the acceptance of each other by two men between whom there was no need of discussion and explanation, who knew that they had the same general attitude to the problems of life and society, as opposed to that of a hostile outside world, two men who knew that each had to at least sometimes bidden defiance to that hostility. I talked with him, in short, as one rebel to another, end quote. Bell's testimony in his unpublished book is unique, for here a committed and knowledgeable anarchist reports, even if 35 years later, a conversation with Wilde about anarchism. His overall conclusion as to Wilde's political position is as convincing as it is judicious. Quote, in his maturity, he was undoubtedly an anarchist of the type of Edward Carpenter or Elisa Reclus, an anarchist philosophic and humanitarian, but clean-cut and plain-spoken, though avoiding the use of the term anarchism itself as one likely to cause misunderstanding in the minds of his readers, end quote.